Well, thank you for that warm welcome, and hola, hello. Thank you for joining our fireside chat today with Gilad Goren, the Executive Director of the Nature Tech Collective. So more broadly, as we know, we don't solve the climate crisis without nature, and those two things are intrinsically linked. And as we think about the many different solutions on the table, technology and as a way of accelerating nature-based solutions is the focus of our conversation today. Before we get started, do feel free to move up if you'd like. But a quick poll of the audience so we know which areas you're all working in, from corporate to startup to investors. Who's with a corporation? Okay. Startup? Okay. And investors? Wonderful. Well, I think that will help a little bit, Gilad, with some of your responses.
That guy's got a target on his back.
So let's begin at the basics. Nature 101, Nature Tech 101. What is nature technology?
Okay. Who here likes nature? Okay, easy one, right? So in our world, when people talk about climate, you hear climate tech a lot. That's basically jargony for carbon, right? So there's this one really important area of greenhouse gas emissions, and we really have to deal with it. That's very true. However, what's not taken into account in much of climate is, well, nature, everything else. Every single company, every single firm, every single living and breathing thing depends on the services that are provided by nature, right? Literally every company. Every company should be here in this room right now hearing this because they're kind of screwed if they're not. And just the fact of the matter. Nature tech is not necessarily a new set of technologies. It is technologies you'll find in climate, which is focusing on carbon again, ag tech, agriculture. Nature tech is a new lens, and that lens is on the transition. Transition from nature negative to nature positive. For example, transition from conventional farming that essentially reduces the output of crops while reducing the quality of the soil, leading to the extinction of biodiversity through monoculture and things of the sort, towards a regenerative form of agriculture that actually revitalizes the soil, makes us healthier, makes the world healthier. A transition from conventional buildings that don't take nature into account to one that actually does take into account and actually becomes part of a living ecosystem. Now, this might sound woo to some, hippie and all that. It's actually a $7 trillion industry, or $7 trillion opportunity for all you startups.
No, that's a great way of framing it. And on the economic point, we also know that more than half of global GDP is either moderately or highly dependent on nature. So it's incredibly relevant. Going a little bit more in depth into the Nature Tech Collective and what Nature Tech is and some of your members, perhaps you can just talk a little bit about some of the things that these businesses are focused on, from bioacoustics to environmental DNA, remote robotics, geospatial imagery, just to give our audience some concrete examples of what the companies do that you're working with.
Sure. So the Nature Tech Collective is a nonprofit organization, and we're trying to build this category. Many of the entrepreneurs, so to take a step back, first and foremost, we're a community of 160 plus members, and we invite you all to join us. Many of them are the actual solutions, the startups. Over the past year, we've had more and more enterprises who need this technology or want to learn more about these technologies and these solutions are joining us as well, as our peer nonprofits, academic institutions. And what we do is we, first of all, provide capacity building services for the for the startups. So whether it's putting them on stages like this, putting them in reports, making connections, our job is to shorten the curve for adoption. So the corporates know what they need to do and get into it, or the private sector, nonprofits, stuff of the sort. In terms of what these nature technologies look like, so you had mentioned bioacoustics. We all talk about AI these days. So bioacoustics is a combination of microphones, hi-fi microphones that are now cheap to make. So people thought about putting microphones in the deep Amazon or in the Congo Basin, collecting all these sounds, and then having machine learning / AI be able to decipher of all the myriad sounds, which ones are these specific birds, which are proxies for health of an ecosystem. So now imagine you could drop these in all these different places. You don't need to have humans going, which is the way it used to be done. You'd send a consultant from McKinsey or something like that, or one of the big project developers, and they just get in. It costs you $10,000, $20,000, just egregious sums for a guy to just fly in, take a temp measure a tree, see some birds. No, we have technology for it. That's an amazing example. However, the other example, which is one that was brought in yesterday from my colleague at Pure Projet, it doesn't have to be technology of the kind we know in the Western world. Here's an amazing technology. We're losing cacao at a drastic rate. A ton of cacao went from $3,000 to $8,000. One of the problems with the cacao trees is that they're very acidic. So the soil is too acidic to basically enable growth of other things. So they discovered that if you just put banana trees around the cacao trees, the leaves that fall down actually salinize and actually make the soil less acidic, which allows for the growth of more cacao. That's a technology. It's not humans creating new robots or something. It's nature's technologies. So it's actually a combination of those two that make nature tech really unique.
And I like that last example because it also illustrates the ways that humans can be learning from nature. The technical term being biomimicry, but taking a step back and thinking about what nature has done for 3.8 billion years and how we might actually be inspired by what's been working in addition to technology. So it's a nice combination of both. Can you speak to some of the things that are needed to scale the technology to advance nature-based solutions a bit more? I think we discussed 4 gaps roughly earlier that will probably help our audience understand what's needed next.
Yeah. So I'm going to say something pretty controversial. I don't think that we need any new technologies in order to solve the nature loss crisis, the Holocene extinction. We have all the technologies we need. The problem is a human problem. It's a coordination problem. So what are these kind of what we call moonshots? One is, you may not know this, but we actually don't know what the state of nature is. We don't know actually how the Amazon is really doing because no one's been able to actually collect the data, the actual nature data, and process it and say, okay, we're at this state. So when you do experiments, usually you have a baseline, and then you have the intervention or the change, and then you're able to measure. We can't really do that, so it's mostly assumptions. That is one moonshot. We nicknamed it the MRI for nature. So a global network that's able to collect nature data in a comprehensive manner and then make it as a public good. How many of you guys have iPhones or smartphones? Right? Who could tell me what the weather is right now in Dar es Salaam? What is it? You guys have a weather app? Go ahead. Someone tell me what the weather is in Dar es Salaam. Dar es Salaam, capital Tanzania. Was it? Huh? I can't hear you. No, it's in Tanzania. It's in Tanzania.
31 degrees, feels like 33.
Feels like 33 degrees. It feels like it's much hotter here. Why am I asking this random ass question? Because any one of us, technically, if we tried, thank you for trying, could do that now. We can't do that for nature data. We don't have a network that's providing this as a service. I think that's a public good we should all have because that would completely change the game. Another one is collecting data, or rather, sharing data. I use this as an example. Coca-Cola collects insane amounts of data on water. Do you see Coca-Cola sharing their data with Pepsi or with any of us? No, because the incentives aren't there. That's the key, is realigning incentives. One project we're working on, where hopefully some people from this room will be helping us, looking at you, FlintPro, is an entity that will actually provide the world with a stock take of what the level of technology is for a specific ecological benefit. In other words, the working group we have right now is telling, okay, this is what nature tech could do for biodiversity monitoring, right? And then here's the gaps, and then let's now test it. Because it's not like carbon where a ton is a ton is a ton, doesn't matter where, right? Biodiversity is very different between Costa Rica and Saudi Arabia. So every bioregion is different. And so there needs to be an entity that tests it. And this is a massive project that we're starting to kick off, and we're going to make some announcements at COP16 in October in Colombia. And the last thing, who's heard of the phrase, software is eating the world? Right, Mark Andreessen. Why is software eating the world? There used to be a bunch of theoretical mathematicians. And eventually there were computer scientists. And then there were these engineers. And now every kid could be a developer. So you could build tech for everything, right? We're still at conservationists. We're still at conservation biologists. We're not at that level. We have a global force that could do the work of setting camera traps, maintaining the camera traps, collecting eDNA, all the kind of stuff that we're able to do that, frankly, anyone could do. Really, anyone could do. The exciting part about it is that part of the equation that's often not spoken about is this thing called social equity, right? How do we actually make sure that what's called IPLCs, right? Indigenous populations and local communities, the people who are already stewarding the lands, doing the work for us, actually get compensated. They could be nature engineers. That's the 4 big challenges, and again, it's not technology, it's the human problem.
That's really helpful, and I'll just bridge one gap, maybe for the corporates in the room who might be curious why we're talking about the data piece, and putting my former CSO hat on. Without baseline data, it's very hard to set these targets, and that's one of the hurdles that we're seeing that corporations have. We've mastered thinking about net zero targets, emissions, climate, but moving to what a localized footprint means for a business from a biodiversity perspective is very difficult, and the data is needed to do that, and we need the technology to be able to get a meaningful amount of data so that regulations can be followed and businesses can set more ambitious targets. The nature finance gap, perhaps you can speak a little bit to this. We know that that gap in funding is in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and without this bridge, it's difficult to scale. Can you speak to what the Nature Tech Collective is doing to help in that respect?
Yeah. So of the startups in the room, how many are actually doing work related to climate or nature? You have a few? OK. How many of you are dealing with things like either accounting, nature or carbon accounting, all that kind of stuff? OK. It's a good time to be in your place. Why? There is a $700 billion annual funding gap for nature, right? Our theory of change, and I think there's consensus on this, is that one of the core reasons this gap exists is because of that fundamental nature data gap that I mentioned. How do we really expect an insurance company to create an insurance product on something where they can't really de-risk, they can't really do the research and say, OK, the likelihood is I'm going to make my money? How could we expect investors to do this de-risking work if they don't have the data to do it? So that's where we're kind of stuck. There is a supposed wall of money that everyone's talking about that will just flow in, and that's what's preventing them from doing so. And so the work that startups in nature data, I'm looking at you, investor, this is an opportunity here, of collecting data. Even think about a post-AI world. AI is, everyone's talking about AI, but it's essentially a garbage in, garbage out problem unless AI has the data it needs. So you guys are on the forefront of collecting that data, assessing that data. Every single company needs this data. I had a conversation with one of the largest firms in the rating world, will be unnamed, and if they don't know how to map data collection to reporting mechanisms, imagine like your average medium to large size company. And so it's both, again, it must be closed or else we're screwed, but it's also an issue of, wow, this is a huge opportunity that just is waiting to be solved.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And we've touched on this, but maybe you can go a little bit deeper into why it is that every industry really needs to be factoring in nature protection. So we alluded to it at the outset, but this is such a fundamental issue that's, I think, missing for a lot of companies.
Yeah. So there's a few stories that we often kind of like use to illustrate. Who likes beer? Is that the whole thing? Yeah? OK, great. I don't think the kids like beer anymore, but beer's good. There is a brewery called New Belgium. It's a microbrewery in Colorado. It was purchased by a very large alcoholic beverage company. And yeah, it was an investment, a really big investment. I don't think they read the news because the Colorado River is drying up. You can't make beer without water. That is a significant loss. Semiconductors. Again, I'm not trying to beat up on AI, but semiconductors. We all need semiconductors. They need a lot of water to cool the systems. Literally every industry is affected or impacts water. When you hear about the coffee industry inventing synthetic coffee, we're in that situation. And so that's why people talk about this AUM in the trillions, because literally every company will have to deal with it. If it's not because of their crop or their supply chain, it's because of incoming regulations, it's because of incentives. Banks are going to want to incentivize you to do the right thing because then they get better terms, or they have commitments as well. So there's a lot of pressure. So we document this in some of our sector intelligence work. One of the 4 M's for when we do a taxonomy of a sector is market pressures. And that's really what's going to move the needle, is basically I have to. Once the conversation goes from, with all due respect, the CSO or the CMO to the CFO, that's when you know we're like, okay, it's real, you know.
Well, and this is a great segue because I think that is the missing demographic in a lot of these conversations. So when we think about nature-related financial risks, not only is this not on the radar of most chief financial officers, but I don't think that it's on the radar of most institutional investors and funds as well, because if they're looking at the risk in their portfolio, if businesses do have this exposure to nature-related risks, it becomes pretty exorbitant pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd love to hear from you, having been a CSO. How do you try to have a conversation with a CFO?
It's all risk.
It's all risk.
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't think many people are engaging CFOs directly, nor a lot of the funds, and that would be a very helpful evolution from having a CSO that's having to advocate internally to CFOs, and then instead having it come the other direction. So I do think there's a big opportunity to go to the source in that respect.
Totally, yeah.
Tell us more about the Nature FinTech sector map. You just did an update of this, and I think it's really relevant to a lot of our audience today.
Yeah, y'all probably heard of fintech. There's a bunch of sessions about fintech, and there's this notion of nature finance. So, like, imagine nature finance is it's the what? It's this transition from it not taking nature into account. I'm just going to invest in what I think has the highest ROI to. I have to innovate new tools that account for nature or that incentivize pro-nature actions. So there's a lot of blue bonds and green bonds. There's a lot of interest into this, insurance products as well. The Nature FinTech is the how. It's actually how it's going to happen. Nature FinTech deals with collecting of data, getting it from the source all the way to the people sitting in Zurich or San Francisco or wherever bankers sit, right? And vice versa. It's incentivizing and paying. The payments go all the way to the source. The local Shipibo native in Bolivia or Peru that's setting up a camera trap or collecting data. It's the use of blockchain and Web3. It's the use of pretty much all the technologies in the gamut. But the cool thing about it is that it's not a vertical, it's actually like a horizontal. It's the piping that allows for money to flow in one way and data to flow the other way. And again, it's an amazing, unique opportunity to invest in because fintech hasn't yet solved things like last mile because the alignments aren't there. It's bottom of the pyramid, it just doesn't make sense, you're not going to make money on it. But if companies now have a reason to send money to the populations that are the most overlooked and are the most crucial for the preservation and the revitalization of our lands, this is now it. So that's why Nature FinTech is really exciting, is that it's basically, again, it's just a new lens, more or less same technologies, but that lens realigns financial interest with nature and social.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask another question and then see if the audience has any questions. So think about whether you want to ask any. But let's go back to the social piece. And we've talked a lot about the environmental side, but we know that these are intrinsically linked. And if we think about engagement of local communities and indigenous populations, this is so fundamental to scaling nature-based solutions. Can you speak a little bit to that and your theory of change that incorporates the social piece?
Yeah. I'm going to get a little jargony. Does anyone ever heard of the term carbon cowboys? No? Okay. So when the world of carbon credits really started coming up, and it was seen as a gold mine. Suddenly land that's just fallow, or sorry, areas that don't have much use or already doing what they're doing suddenly could earn another revenue stream in the form of carbon credits. So what ended up happening with things like REDD+, which is essentially you're paying for the owner of the land not to rip up the trees, right? They're incentivized not to do so. So all these people from the global north saying, okay, I could buy this land really cheap and just then go and say, hey, I'm going to totally destroy this land unless you give me money like right now. And especially when it came to working with indigenous populations or local communities, they would pay in pennies. They would buy the lands for them, or not even buy the lands. They just kind of like rent the rights and totally screw them over. And then it got even worse because indigenous populations or local communities that have had their ways for generations, agroforestry is an example, or sustainable forestry, they're suddenly told you can't do this because it's a REDD+ project. So they basically got not only ripped off, but also had to change their ways. So there's been a lot of antipathy towards anything related to the greens from the indigenous populations in a lot of the frontline communities. Farmers who have been cattle ranching, for example, if you go to a lot of people who are conservationists, cattle is anathema. You can't talk cattle. It's the worst thing in the world. Well, it's a way of life for many, many people for many, many years. So let's get real. That's what's going to happen. So when it comes to interacting with frontline communities and indigenous populations, you have to come at it, and this is what we're trying to bring forth. Number one, respect, right? Their ways, turns out, it's the way it's supposed to work. The Amazon, it was not a wild forest. The Amazon has been stewarded by indigenous peoples for a long time. We're still discovering the highways in the Amazon because they've done that work, right? And so they have a lot of knowledge to give us, and hopefully we haven't lost it all. And number two, we have to protect, there has to be a lot of issues around data and privacy, data and protection. That's where things like blockchain can play an amazing role. But essentially, we can't let this carbon cowboy mentality take over nature, or else we're just going to get to the same kind of loop.
Yeah.
And there's developments in that space, so it's really great to see that, right?
Excellent. Well, thank you for bringing that lens in. I have more questions, but let me just check and see if anyone in the audience wants to ask a question.
Come on, who's got brave? Who's brave?
Yes.
So many different diverse areas that different metrics they're way more, so they're more important.
Yeah.
How can you take all those metrics and make it simple where weigh the metrics that are most important? Like every place has different metrics that have different importance.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just repeat the first part in case those in the back didn't hear, but essentially the question, which is a great one, how do we account for the complexity of biodiversity, knowing that it's not as simple as climate data, and what are the metrics we use to reflect that?
Yeah. Let me preface that by saying that next week I have to defend quantifying nature in a debate. So if anyone wants to give me tips on why we should be quantifying in the first place, that'd be great. Because nature, how do we put a number to it, right? It's kind of absurd. But in this present system, we just have to, because that's how the system works. What you say is absolutely true. Nature doesn't respect political boundaries, right? They don't care if the line passes here or not. A river is a river is a river. There's bioregions as well instead. So it's been sort of mapped out. There's 37 basic bioregions, and that bioregion is an ecosystem where certain sets of species live, and they could be used as markers for the health of an ecosystem. Everyone is totally different. And one of the difficulties is kind of figuring out, number one, which one are the best proxies, because you can't just collect all the data. So you have to find someone who could be either a keystone species or be a marker of the health of an ecosystem. In certain areas, for example, bats are really good for that. Some people think that it is the apex predator. That is the right proxy for it. Some think it's trees. That's one thing. Number two is you have to be realistic. You can't afford also. There's certain areas of data collection that just at this point, it's too expensive. So there's a lot of weighing through. The way this nascent but growing sector called biodiversity credits is doing it, because they're trying to make it fungible, is that they look at one of three markers. Either a credit is issued if there's uplift, so just basic numbers. They'll use something like eDNA. eDNA is basically collecting a sample of water or air from a specific area and extrapolating how many species and how many of the species are there. amazing technology. So you're either measuring uplift or measuring preservation and conservation. So basically, now you think about additionality. In the world of carbon credits, it was about trees ripping off trees or whatever. Here it's, hey, I'm going to develop this land, but I actually would rather not. The credits will pay me not to do so. And I've measured how much and how rich the biodiversity is and how much it would be lost. And so that is where a mechanism like that works. So they have two basic buckets of how to do it. But I mean, your question is really valid because it's really complicated. It's not a ton is a ton is a ton. And that's why there's so much more that we have to do just to set up things like setting up a baseline to understand what the state of nature is. Yeah.
And from one region, let's just take Spain to the next, what biodiversity means is very different, which is why it's just so complicated, so much more complicated than climate and greenhouse gas emissions. So I don't think anyone has all the answers yet, but your question is at the heart of what most of this is trying to solve for.
Yeah, he's like right there.
Yes.
How do you see your regulation in Europe or in US 10 years or 5 years from now?
How do you see the relation?
How you see their regulation?
Oh, the
Regulation.
regulation.
10 years or 5 years from now in Europe versus US?
Yeah. You want to take that on first?
Sure. Well, Europe is far ahead of the US in this respect already. Between the UK, the EU, you have the UK biodiversity net gain legislation, the CRSD in the EU, and the Task Force on Nature-Related Climate Disclosures. So Europe is much farther along. The US, I think, will have to follow because if you have a global company, you're not going to have a different standard for business operations in the US if you also have European operations. So I think that's how the US will be pulled forward. But tell me if you have other perspectives.
Yeah, agreed. I would say in terms of the US, there's this little thing called an election coming up. That should change a lot. I mean, under the last administration, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is an interesting name, created just immense opportunities through things like tax equity credits for like the building of renewable energy and all that kind of stuff. And nature's now getting into the conversation. The White House just had a summit recently on nature. I would say that generally the way the US works, it's private sector first at this point. Political gridlock's going to be what it is. So a lot of American companies that are expressing interest not necessarily because they're afraid of US regulations. It's more about, I'm not going to have my product in 10 years because the crop or the supply line is going to be over. Or it's more like, the bank is not going to give me my loans. So it's all these different pressures.
Do you see Europe moving back in regulation?
Not if you guys vote against it. Step your game up, guys. Like we had there's a whole movement against the rollback of it. I hope not.
Oh, the restoration law.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think a lot of businesses also, even if it is not a forced regulatory disclosure, they're using this as a proxy for risk. So, it comes in both ways. We're nearing the end of our time, so I'll just take the privilege of the moderator to ask the last question, which is, how do you see some of your members incorporating innovation as it relates to nature-based solutions?
So we have the privilege of working with large NGOs, big corporates. They already have an interest in this space because they know they have to. Slowly becoming, something that the CFOs have to consider. And so this answer is half an invitation. There are open innovation centers outside. There is increasing interest. The best way to go about it is honestly, it could be us or it could be someone else. There are already organizations that are trying to cluster information. And just, if we could shorten the path for a corporate to actually just get into the innovation pace, beyond just testing the waters, but like now let's try a pilot, then we could sleep happy. And so that's really the call, is to look at us, Nature for Climate, any of these organizations, and get it done.
Yeah, and I think
And now we're going to get a rapper.
I'll tell you, and now I'm
Okay.
going to spit some sick bars and lay down some beats or whatever it's called. No, I'm going to interrupt. I'm so sorry because we do have a very tight schedule.
Excellent.
That was absolutely wonderful. That wasn't just a fireside chat. That was a rallying call. That was an invitation. And I hope you're all going to get involved. But first, can we have a huge round of applause for Laura and Gilad? Thank you. Wonderful stuff. Thank you so much. And thank you.